director of classical concerts. He's directed orchestras all over the world. And he was named the director of the orchestra in Krakow in Poland. And through that connection, he made a very close connection with Pope John Paul II, now known as St. John Paul II. And we gave you some introduction in your classes to his background, so I will not speak much longer other than to tell you that among his many honors, Sir Gilbert was honored by the current Pope, Pope Francis, as a Pontifical Knight Grand Cross of the Equestrian Order of St. Gregory the Great. That knighthood began in 1834, and only 34 people have been given that honor. As a result of that honor, believe it or not, Sir Gilbert can ride on horseback into St. Peter's. And he's saluted by the Swiss Guard whenever he's there. Without further ado, Sir Gilbert.
Without the horse. No horse today. And I will never ride into St. Peter's. I think that the Swiss Guards these days will shoot me before they allow me to do that. I wanted to start just by showing you a portion of a concert that I conducted in Washington in honor of the sainthood, the canonization of John Paul and John the 23rd. So if we could show that, that would be great. So I have a question. What language were they singing? Hebrew. The Psalms were written in Hebrew. And that chorus, which was made up of all kinds of people from all different countries, was singing in the language that the Psalms were originally written in. But the story is, how did I get there? How did I get to be conducting on that podium for the canonization of 2 popes? My family comes from Poland, but we came to Brooklyn, to Manhattan first, to Ellis Island, with nothing. When I say nothing, my grandmother had an apartment that was she had so little money that she had to rent out my father's bed. So my father slept with his nose here, and the boarder slept on the other side. And when she didn't have enough money, my grandmother, to feed him, she put him in an orphanage, and then took him out of the orphanage, and then put him back in the orphanage and took him out of the orphanage. Nothing. My mother's family, my grandfather was a butcher. He left the family. My uncle took over providing for the family at the age of 15, and they had nothing to eat. So we were not a family born to privilege. We had nothing. My family worked really, really hard to be able to put me through school, to give me the opportunities that I got. I was raised in an area that was completely Jewish. I knew one Catholic kid. One Catholic kid. I got an offer. You know the poem, the Robert Frost poem, The Road Not Taken? Yes. I took that other one. I was offered a job that would have paid me 9 times what I made in Krakow. They paid me in złoty in Krakow, which is the most beautiful wallpaper you can imagine. You can't buy anything with it, but it's great wallpaper. But my family, you know something called the Holocaust? Yeah. My family lost 40 members in the Holocaust. Murdered in Auschwitz, which is 40 kilometers from Krakow. So when somebody said, a very famous composer, Polish composer, said, "Would you come and be the conductor in Krakow?" My first reaction was, "Are you crazy?" Then I went to my mother-in-law, who had lost so many people in the Holocaust, and she said, I said, "Should I go?" And she said, "Yes, you must go." And I went there, Jewish kid, Catholic city. Krakow had been a city of 80,000 Jews. There were 200 left, and they were scared out of their minds. I'd never met a Catholic priest. 5 days after I arrive in Krakow, I'm invited to meet the Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow. I go in and I see him. He greets me as the new conductor of the Krakow Philharmonic, and he said, "If this interview had taken place 60 years ago, it would have been with the chief rabbi. We don't have a chief rabbi anymore. So I want to be your spiritual host here." That cardinal, Cardinal Maharsky, was the successor as cardinal in Krakow to John Paul II. Poland was under communism. Did you know about the East Bloc? You know about totalitarian communism? The signature element in totalitarian communism was a freedom from religion. You could not freely practice your faith, Jewish or otherwise, but it was a Catholic country. And yet, if you went on Sundays by a church, in the middle of winter, there would be people out the door. They would have 3, 4 Sunday masses, and each one of them would be filled, and they would have the doors open with incredible, terrible cold air coming in, because you can't squash the need for a spiritual life. I went to this Catholic country. I was invited to meet this cardinal. There was no press freedom. You were not allowed to buy a newspaper. You weren't allowed to buy, unless it was the absolute word of the Communist Party. Newsweek was brought into the country for the very elite to read. The cardinal was one of those elite. He read about me in Newsweek because I was the first Westerner ever to head an artistic institution in the entire East Bloc. Talking about crazy, I was a little bit nuts to do that. But something told me it was important. He ripped out the page, and when he went to see the Pope, which he did because he was the successor of the Pope said, "What's new in Krakow?" He said, "You wouldn't believe. This guy has just come from America, where they have freedom, where they have religious freedom and all other, and he's come to Krakow to be the conductor." And what the Pope said, and I only learned this years and years later, was, "You meet him. If he's not crazy, I'd like to meet him." And he sat down with me and had a conversation with me in which he asked me all kinds of questions. Make a long story short, about 2 months after I met Cardinal Maharsky, I found myself in the private library of the Pope in the Vatican alone. Nobody gets to be alone with the Pope. The President of the United States has to have a secretary. There must be someone in the room because they don't want people to misquote what the Pope says or what the President says. So the Pope has a secretary who's there, and the President has an assistant who's there. The heads of state, when they meet the Pope, have to be together. I was completely alone. Not my choice, the Pope's choice. Sits down with me and says, "I read about you in Newsweek. I know your whole story. We must talk." You want to know how far my mouth was down below my shoes? Because this was the third priest I ever met in my life. First one was the cardinal, the second one was the private secretary of the Pope, and the third one was John Paul himself. John Paul was brought up in Wadowice, which is a really small town near Krakow, also with no money. He, the future Pope, the future saint, did not have enough money to pay for parochial school. So the public school in the city of Wadowice, which was 30% Jewish, was all Jews. So this Catholic, very devout Catholic kid, parents, mother died when he was very young, sister died when she was an infant, brother died. He was completely orphaned, basically. His father did survive his childhood, went to public school and therefore played soccer on the team, went to school with Jewish kids, was the goalie on the soccer team with kids. All those kids on that team, except 3, were murdered in the Holocaust. Murdered. So his friends, he saw them murdered. He goes to the Jagiellonian University, which is one of the great universities of Europe, one of the oldest universities of Europe, studies theater, studies literature, and decides in the middle of World War II that he wants to be a priest. Now that's a wonderful calling, but in 1943, it was a murderous calling because the Nazis were murdering priests. There's a famous picture in the Holocaust Museum in Washington of priests sitting in front of Bydgoszcz Cathedral, a small town in Poland, waiting to be murdered one by the Nazis. He had the courage to become a priest when it was really dangerous, and so he had to take his ordination in the basement of the cathedral in secret. He lived under communism, was an incredible fosterer of religion, of the Catholic faith, but had this deep understanding that we're all together, that we're all the same. When I met him, I was even crazier because I said to myself, I'm never going to meet the Pope again. This is already an accident, a fate, of history, whatever it is, never going to happen again. So I said to him, which I don't even know where the words came from, I believe, Your Holiness, you were put on this earth to make things better between your people and mine. Crazy thing to say. No, I said, I believe God put you on this earth. I want to remember the words. It was literally completely nuts. He didn't say a word. I'm sitting there at his desk. He's got his hand on mine. He took his hand away, and he's looking down. Completely lost. And I was sure that I had said the stupidest thing one could possibly say to anyone, let alone the Pope. Hung his head, incredibly deep in thought. And then there's a button on the floor that I didn't know about, that he stepped on, that had tons of people come in. The press, other people from the Vatican, all kinds of people. He still didn't look like he was right. They brought out a silver tray with a medal for me and some prayer beads for my wife, and he crossed his hands. He's still completely discombobulated. A guy from the prefect of the pontifical household, who sort of runs the ceremonial part of his life, comes over and said, "No, Your Holiness, she gets the beads," and he finally goes to the door, and he said, "See you at your concert." I said, "What? What concert?" He just smiles, and he left. That was in February of 1988. To make an extremely long story short, that, instead of being the last time I met the Pope, was the beginning of a 17-year relationship. And I can tell you that every single time I left him, I thought it was my last time, and I would count the steps going out of the Apostolic Palace. Except he stopped having me go up the steps, and he had me coming up the private elevator. The private elevator in the back was where he had people who were not sort of ceremonial guests, but people he actually wanted to have conversations with or do his work with. And what we did, the work we did, was that he came to believe that music, my art, could be of use to him in making things right between our peoples, Jews and Christians, and then, especially after 9/11, but even before, between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Have any of you been to a symphony concert? 1, 2, 3. That's the craziest thing you saw me do, because I don't make a noise. That baton I have makes absolutely no noise. So what I have to do is get the 80 members of the orchestra of St. Luke's that you saw and the 200 members of that choir to come together in harmony without making any noise, just from my mind and my spirit to theirs, to make music for everyone to hear. And it's a kind of an alchemy, and I believe it's actually what I would call a spiritual transference. Because what I feel about the music, what I understand about the music, they understand, and they bring their expertise, and I bring mine, and we come together. We did, I say we, the Pope and I, it sounds like a weird thing to say, but we did many concerts together all over the world. In Korea, in San Luis Rey, in France, in Poland, in Italy, in Germany, many concerts together. One of the greatest was a concert I did. It wasn't even a concert, it was the vigil service at World Youth Day in 1993. Have you ever heard of the Catholic Church's World Youth Day? Yeah. Great. They had one in Denver. It was outdoors in the worst place you could choose, but it was the only place they could find 500,000 kids. And he had me, and I said, "Your Holiness, you want me to conduct?" He said, "Yes," and I didn't know why. So when you do a pontifical performance, there's a conversation that goes back and forth with the Vatican about what's proper and what's not proper. And it's all done in a book, and the book is printed, and you're told to go from 1 to 32, exactly what they tell you to do. I'm done with 25, maybe 26, and the Pope's private secretary comes over to me and says, "Switch 32 and 31. Okay. And I start conducting number 32 where number 31 was, and first the double basses stop playing, and then the cello stop playing, and then this, and they're all looking behind me. And behind me is the Pope, who's come up behind me and is starting to wave his arms, imitating my gestures, in front of 500,000 screaming Catholic kids. The orchestra stops. He comes over to me, puts his arm around me, and says, "Did I disturb you, Maestro?" I said, "Yes, you want the baton?" It was an amazing moment, and I knew then why he invited me. How many of you have a Jewish friend? Not very many of those Catholic kids, 500,000 Catholic kids, had a Jewish friend. He was showing that he had this friendship with this Jewish artist, and if he could do it, then a bishop could do it, then a kid could do it. we can all reach out. If I can go to Poland where there are no Jews left, if he could be in school with no Catholic kids because he couldn't afford it, and go to school with Jewish kids who were really his best friends growing up, then every one of those people could open their minds, open their hearts, and maybe find a way to have a friendship so that we don't misunderstand one another. I have to tell you this. I went to Juilliard before I went to Princeton. Juilliard was at the time a trade school for music, nothing more. They didn't care about your brain, they cared about how fast you could play. That's all they cared about. I needed some money, so I went and put input in a computer, did some work inputting. I didn't know anything about computers either, but somehow I was able to do that. And a professor there, really famous Beethoven professor, came up to me and started a conversation with me, and he said, where are you in school? I said, Juilliard. He said, why are you wasting your brain? Come study here. If you think that it was easy for me, trade school dedicated musician, to go to a place like Princeton, and also to be Jewish, because it wasn't exactly the most philo-Jewish place in the history of the world at the time. I said, I would like to eat kosher. I said this to the dean of students. He said, well, we don't have any possibility of giving you kosher food. Eat on Nassau Street. That's the main street of Princeton. There's no kosher restaurant on Nassau Street. He had no clue. He had no clue. So we're all different. We all have different backgrounds. Every single person in this country comes from someplace else. Every single person. My family does, your family does, your family does. They all come from someplace else. And everybody has to get ahead in the only way that it's possible to get ahead, by really hard work. Everybody. My grandmother, what she ground, and she was the most amazing woman. I loved her. What she did, I mean, for the first years of my life, I thought it was so cruel of her to, first of all, to put a border in with my father, and second of all, to send him, he went to Queens College. She somehow found a way for him to go to Queens College, which was tuition free at the time, but still, she had to find a way to get him to go there, because she honored education. She knew that education was the way out, just as my parents did, my grandparents did, and they understood it. So I've had a kind of a strange life, if you could put it that way, and to go to the Vatican and to have them call me Your Excellency, I look around me every single time and say, who are they talking to? It's been a very weird ride, and I have now friends. Joe Parks is a friend of mine, not just somebody I met. Many cardinals are friends of mine. I attribute that to John Paul. I attribute that to his saying, we're all human beings. We're all in this together. We all have the responsibility to make our communal life, our society, our world a better place. And I literally thank God every day for having made me so crazy as to go to Poland, and then thank John Paul every day for the trust he had in me. And I wanted to share that story. But mostly I have to tell you also that Joe Parks introduced me to Cristo Rey. There were Cristo Rey kids at that concert in Washington who were the best part of that audience. Pardon me. I believe in you. I believe what you're doing is unbelievable. And I wanted to come here to tell you that story, but also to ask you to answer any questions you might have, because that's a really important part of what this is about. So thank you, and I'm pleased. Any questions? Why exactly did I?
Did you feel like you had to go to the east?
That's a really, really good question. And it's one my wife, who had to put food on the table, asked as well, because the pay was terrible. I actually felt very strongly that since so many of my family was murdered in Poland, that I had to go back, that I had to show the world that they got some of us, they didn't get all of us. And my family had been in Poland for 900 years before they were murdered. My family had been there longer than most Polish families have been there. But we were the other. We were the people who were the other. So therefore, when people got a lot of power and very bad moral and ethical values, they decided to literally annihilate us. And I thought it was really important to go back and to work to make things better so that didn't happen ever again. I thought that's a great question. It's really important, and it's one I've thought about a lot. It changed my life. It was literally the road not taken, but the real question is why I did it, and I think it was to honor the memory of my relatives. Please.
When did your passion for music come about? How did you get into music?
When did my passion for music come about? From the age of 3, we had a little teeny piano in my house. My mother played folk songs on the piano. She didn't know anything about classical music. There were 2 classical records in my house, and I still don't know how they got in there because my parents had no interest in classical music at all. I could not even reach, the piano. I was 3 years old. I was reaching up and playing really horrendous sounds, I'm sure. To me, they sounded like God's music. And I can't tell you why that is, but I was completely taken with sound. And then, very important, when I was maybe 10, 11 years old, I saw on television a guy named Leonard Bernstein who wrote that incredible piece. You ever heard the name? America's most successful composer, classical composer, and he did young people's concerts. And he did them on television with the New York Philharmonic, and they were unbelievable. And I thought, wow, this guy gets up there, has classical music coursing through him, is conducting this orchestra, and he's literally infecting all of us with the love of classical music. And he was my idol, and one of the reasons that I've done so much of his work on television is because I owe him and because he was a great artist. But that's a great question too. Please.
During Unit 1, we learned a lot about forgiveness amongst different beliefs. So I was just wondering, have you found it in your heart to forgive those people that did that to your family?
Yes, and in fact, forgiveness is really incredibly hard and really important. And I think part of why I went there instead of to the orchestra that was offering me 9 times, I want to repeat, 9 times as much money, was because something in me knew that it was the right thing to do, to make a bond with these people. I conduct a lot in Germany. Germany was the source of Nazism. But those people that I'm conducting now are not responsible for the murders. They may even be the children or the grandchildren of those people, but they're not responsible. I'm not going to hold them responsible for the murder of my relatives at all. Many Jewish artists won't go to Germany to work, won't conduct there. I've conducted in Cologne Cathedral. I've conducted in Munich. I've conducted in all kinds of places in Berlin, in all kinds of places in Germany, because I am about not forgetting what happened, but forgiving and moving forward. You can't forget, you will never forget, but you cannot allow it to color your relationship with people who had nothing to do with it. Even if they did and if they begged forgiveness, yes, if they see the light and they understand that they did something that was terrible, you have to, because you're not human if you don't. And you never grow and you never move forward if you don't. John Paul was a great rabbi. The word rabbi means teacher. He was the greatest rabbi I have ever known in my life. He taught I was so privileged because he taught me so many things about human nature, about what it means to forgive. He was incredible, and he was that kind of teacher for the whole world. That's, I think, what makes him a saint. Not because he was perfect, because he didn't think he was perfect, but because he really did have that capacity to forgive. Please.
So what does your symphonies express? Does it express your Jewish traditions?
No, it expresses humanity. That's the really important thing about music. It's not, even if it's a work by a Catholic composer, it's drawing from the Catholic faith to express what is universal. If it's by a Jewish composer, it's universal. Beethoven was a devout Catholic. He wrote universal music that expresses what binds us together as human beings. Even if the work, like this work, is in Hebrew. It was written by Bernstein, who was a Jewish composer, for the Three Choirs Festival for Chichester Cathedral, a Church of England cathedral, Anglican church. There is nothing about music that is sectarian. Music is universal. Please.
How has your passion for music and conducting helped you cope with your past or what occurred to your family?
Everybody's ticket out of stress is different. Everybody has to find what speaks to them. Mine was definitely music. So music has made me a better person. The discipline is crazy. I studied with a teacher who was teaching at Harvard, but she taught me at another place, and she gave me 6 lessons a week. I had to work 7 hours a day for each of those lessons, and the 8th hour, and I said, I want to take Wednesday. She said, take Wednesday off. Then you work the other 6 days. Take Sunday off. And you have to work the other 6 days. She didn't care. She was a slave driver is the wrong word. She was a really terrible disciplinarian. At one point in the middle of this summer, I walked in and I said, I can't do this anymore. And I almost broke down in tears. And she said, so quit. If you don't have what it takes to do what it is that you have to do in order to be a musician, then don't be a musician. Everything you want to do in life is going to take that work. Maybe not that maniacal work, but that a lot of work. Nobody gives you anything in life. Father Joe will never talk about what it means to be a Jesuit and what it takes to be a Jesuit, but it's a years-long training. Years and years and years and years. It's not even just coursework, it's work in life. Because to achieve something, and we are all capable of achieving our goals, whatever our goals are, it takes work. Each of you is going to universities, great universities. Every single one of you is just going to have to prove themselves for yourself. And the other thing I want to tell you is that I met this guy, Lockwood, and he became my mentor at Princeton. I would not have been able to acculturate to Princeton, have been able to understand the university without forging that relationship. I urge you to find a mentor, to find somebody who you think understands your life and your background and your experience well, and talk to them and get them to be somebody who cares and listens and can give you advice. It is priceless. That man is 86 today, and I still call him once every 3 or 4 weeks to find out how he is and also to learn. Those relationships are incredibly important, and you can have them at any university, wherever you go, and it's important because landing at a university, I can tell you, I felt like a complete fish out of water. Completely. These Princeton kids were all private school, waspy kids, unbelievably wealthy. I didn't have much in common with them. Except I had a brain, and I was going to use it to the best of my ability, and I was going to work my tail off. And that was what made it a successful experience for me. Each of you has what you do well. You have to find out what that is and then dedicate yourself to it, and there's nothing, absolutely nothing that can stop you. I'm completely convinced. Please.
What are some characteristics that you would attribute to like meeting the Pope and like his personality?
What are the characteristics that I attribute to the Pope and his personality? You met the Pope, and he, you know, anybody here play chess? Yeah, he was like 4 moves ahead. He was like, you walked in and he knew where the problem was. He knew how to get around the corner to the problem. He knew what the problem would be when you went around the corner. And so the conversations with him were, he looked in your eyes, and it's almost like he downloaded your brain. He just knew what you were thinking, what you were feeling, and then he wanted your input. The craziest thing was, I was sure that what it meant to work with the Pope was he would assign me, he would order me to do something, and I would do it. Instead, I would say, Maestro, what do you think about this? Now, he wouldn't ask me about doctrinal issues in the church. He wouldn't ask me about any of that. He would ask me about music, and he would ask me, if it was in the case of an interfaith concert, what would the Jewish community think? And once I said to him, Your Holiness, you're asking me? I'm not a rabbi. He said, no, I can't trust people who have a vested interest in the answer. I want your answer because you're somebody I trust. So he was a person who understood people, he understood cardinals, he understood the highest people in the church and the average Catholic, and I would say, on my own experience, the average human being on this church, on this earth. He reacted, I was in New York on 9/11 and was completely horrified by what I saw. And then I was called to the Vatican, and what he said to me was, I can't believe they said God is great as they were flying the planes into the building. That can't be what Muslims are. That can't be who Muslims are. His reaction was not to be angry. His reaction was, how do we do that? How do we understand what that was about? And after he had spent years and years working with me on using music to connect to Jews, he used me to connect to Muslims. And we did 2 incredibly important concerts broadcast around the world to celebrate, to commemorate, to honor the unity among Christians, Jews, and Muslims, all of whom stem from Abraham. Abraham. You got this tree, it's called Abraham. And you got one branch that's Judaism, another branch is Christianity, and the third branch. God said to Abraham and to Hagar that she would be the mother of a great nation. God didn't play favorites. Yes, we were the first, but out of us came Jesus. Abraham was the uniter, and God understood that all of us are together on this earth, and we got to find a way. If you look at the problems in the Middle East and the problems of any, religion is at the heart of it, but it's a complete misperception of what religion is. Islam is a nation of peace. Christianity is born of peace. Judaism is the religion of the Psalms. It is I consider myself a Jew of the Beatitudes. If you read the Beatitudes of Jesus and you're a Jew, there is not a word in the Beatitudes that you can't wholly subscribe to. The Psalms, like the one you heard sung in Hebrew, are holy to all 3 monotheistic religions. Just the same. There is no difference. There's a different way we get to God, but God is in all of us, and Abraham is that root.
Gilbert, you mentioned your mother-in-law before and her family. Did she ever have a chance to meet His Holiness?
Oh, you wouldn't believe it. So I go to conduct the first concert I was invited to conduct was the concert for his 10th anniversary as Pope. I have to tell you a secret. I had never conducted a work of Catholic music in my life. And the first time I'm doing it is at the Vatican, in front of the Pope, and maybe the world on television. Anyway, so I'm rehearsing this, and I get to the dress rehearsal, and the Pope is coming to the concert. And a member of the pontifical household comes and said, the Pope would like to see you. And I said, yeah, I'm going to see him at the concert. No. And who is with you? And I said, well, my wife and my mother-in-law. And, well, they should come too. He wasn't randomly asking. He knew she was there. And I walk in, and he puts his arm around me conspiratorially, and he says, you had enough rehearsal time? I said, why? He said, the Pope is coming. It's an important concert. Did you have enough rehearsal? It was a joke. My mother-in-law is a survivor of Auschwitz, of every station imagined, Bergen-Belsen, which is where Anne Frank died. My mother-in-law was on the death march with Anne Frank from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen. Anne Frank died. My mother-in-law thankfully didn't die. And she met the Pope, and they both spoke Polish. And he took her aside, and they began speaking like two people who had seen the worst that mankind can deliver. He in Poland seeing priests murdered, seeing his Jewish friends murdered, and she seeing her entire family murdered before her eyes. And they found a connection. She was a person, because of what she had lived through, that was completely closed in. She would go into the kitchen at night and smoke and not talk, because she couldn't talk. She could talk to her family, but she couldn't express what was in her heart. Through her relationship with the Pope, and you're going to think this is crazy, but it's the truth, she opened up. She said, finally somebody hears. Finally somebody understands. So this Jewish lady died in a room with a picture of her mother and father murdered by the Nazis, her brother murdered by the Nazis, and herself and the Pope. I believe if there was a third miracle necessary to make him a pope, make him a saint, that was the third miracle, because I saw it, my wife saw it, my brother-in-law saw it, everyone saw it. She opened up. She died angry because God was taking her when she had finally found life again. She wanted to play with her grandchildren. And he saw fit to take her. But that relationship was astounding between the Pope and my mother-in-law. Really amazing. And I think it was done also to teach the world. There was something very public about it. One more.
How about the teachers? Ms. Reagan?
Yeah.
I guess I do have a question. As our seniors embark on a new journey, I guess what is, from your entire life experience and everything that you've learned, the best piece of advice that you could give to them?
Trust yourself. Trust who you are. Don't let anyone tell you you can't do something. If you believe you can do it in your heart of hearts, turn off the lights, put a blanket over your head and say, what am I? What do I want to be? Don't let anyone tell you you can't do it. Because if I listed the number of people... So I should say this. The cell phone once rang in the Apostolic Palace when I was with the Pope, and I was an idiot because I hadn't turned it off, and he said, "Take it; it might be important." I said, I said, no, I don't think so. It's okay.
Thank you very much, Gilbert. Gilbert, when he was planning that great concert, you saw part of that, a celebration of peace through music. The title of that concert tells you something. So we have a link to that, and your teachers will send you that link, and sometime you can sit and watch and listen to that whole concert. It's absolutely magnificent. We packed the hall in Washington, D.C., and it was a tremendous part of the celebration of the canonization of the three popes. And there are also little interstices in there, so Gilbert visited the areas that they came from and talks about them. I gave him some introduction to Buenos Aires. I had just been there. Again, Gilbert, thank you very much.